It all started on a rainy Thursday afternoon in downtown Chicago. The streets glistened like spilled mercury, and the reflection of neon signs shimmered across puddles as people rushed by, umbrellas snapping in the wind. I, Catherine Harper, 30, an ambitious marketing strategist, was running late for an important meeting that could change my career forever. I had spent the past 6 months pitching a campaign to a tech startup that was on the verge of exploding in popularity. This was my chance. My best friend, Vanessa, 31, had promised to support me, to help me network and get inside access. She was charming, confident, and magnetic, the kind of person who could open any door, but she also had a history of taking shortcuts that left others vulnerable. I parked my car in the tight garage beneath a sleek, glass-clad office building and hurried inside, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. Vanessa was already there, sipping a latte, her perfectly styled blonde hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Catherine, you made it," she chirped with that dazzling smile that could disarm anyone. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something I didn't catch at the time. "I'm running late. Are the executives ready?" "Oh, they're just warming up," she said, casually flipping her phone in her manicured hand. I didn't notice that she was already sending a text as she spoke. The presentation went perfectly, or so I thought. My slides were sharp, my ideas innovative, and my confidence radiated from every word. The executives nodded, smiled, asked questions, and I answered with precision. I could almost hear the promotion knocking at my door. Then Vanessa leaned in, whispering something about minor changes I hadn't anticipated. Before I could react, she had casually altered a critical file on my laptop, redirecting the presentation to highlight her own ideas rather than mine. I froze as the room erupted in questions about concepts I had never mentioned. My face burned as confusion spread across the executive's expressions. Vanessa smiled sweetly, feigning ignorance, and subtly took over my narrative, answering questions I didn't even know were being asked. By the end of the meeting, what had been my breakthrough moment had been completely hijacked. The executives were impressed with Vanessa. She had stolen not just my ideas, but the opportunity I had been building for months. I left the building, my mind reeling, the rain soaking through my coat. Every drop felt like a silent accusation. How could someone I trusted betray me so deeply? I called Vanessa, trying to keep my voice calm. "Vanessa, what happened?" "Oh, Kat, don't overreact. You did great. But, in this world, you have to be adaptable. I just helped shape the presentation so it resonated more. You'll thank me later." I didn't thank her. I hung up, trembling with a mix of rage and humiliation. At that moment, I swore I would not let her get away with this. Over the next few days, Vanessa gloated subtly, posting pictures of herself celebrating the successful campaign on social media. My phone flooded with messages from people congratulating her. I was invisible in a crowd that I had worked to impress. But revenge, I realized, is not instantaneous. It requires patience, planning, and precision. I began documenting everything: emails, files, timestamps, every piece of evidence showing that the ideas were mine. I also began observing her habits. Vanessa was meticulous and predictable. She loved routine, her apartment was pristine, and she flaunted her social life with weekly brunches at upscale rooftop cafes. Perfect. I could use that. Then came the first break in her armor. Vanessa had a weakness. She couldn't resist being seen as superior in front of others. Her arrogance was her Achilles heel. I started planting small, believable rumors about her exclusive insider knowledge being fraudulent. Nothing aggressive, just subtle, enough to sow doubt in her social circle. Meanwhile, I quietly contacted some of my industry connections, hinting that Vanessa's portfolio was overstated and that some of the work credited to her had originated from other sources. No accusations, just facts framed in questions. "Have you seen the original campaign file? Interesting how these ideas line up with someone else's work." The first domino fell 3 weeks later. At a networking event in a sleek rooftop lounge overlooking Lake Michigan, Vanessa was chatting with a key industry player, someone who could have further boosted her career. She was flaunting her supposed success when I subtly asked about the project files from the startup campaign. Her confident smile faltered. She stammered, trying to defend herself. The executive raised an eyebrow and asked to see documentation. Vanessa had none. Her charm had no backup, her credibility now questioned. I didn't confront her directly. I watched quietly from across the room, sipping my cocktail as her world began to wobble. Friends who had once admired her suddenly exchanged skeptical glances. It was beautiful. But the night was only halfway over. Back at my apartment, I reviewed everything carefully. Revenge is not just about exposing someone, it's about timing, precision, and making sure the lesson sticks. Vanessa needed to feel the impact of her betrayal, not just professionally, but socially, personally, and financially. I had a plan, but it would take weeks to execute. A single misstep could alert her and all would be lost. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of control I hadn't felt since that meeting. For every lie, every betrayal, every stolen opportunity, she would pay.
The next morning, I woke before dawn. Because revenge is a project, and projects require discipline, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and let the city wake up in pixels and light. There was a satisfaction in methodical work, compiling timelines, cross-referencing emails, saving every draft. I had learned in my corporate years that chaos is only frightening to those who haven't measured it. I had measured everything. First, I tightened the screws on the credibility questions I'd seeded at that rooftop event. I reached out to a trusted contact at the startup, someone who had admired my original pitch months ago, but who had been politely sidelined by Vanessa's charm. I didn't accuse. Accusations can be dismissed. I asked a single, precise question. Do you have a copy of the original campaign deck? There's a discrepancy in the file metadata, and I'm trying to reconcile versions. Within an hour, the contact responded. Actually, yes, I do. We were wondering about that deck ourselves. Email me and I'll forward. Small victory. Evidence that could be corroborated. I felt the cold thrill of control. Behind every social smear I planned was a core of documented truth. Without it, the lies could be shrugged off. I collected the file like a priest collecting relics. Meanwhile, Vanessa kept posting, smiling at wine bars, hugging the CEO she'd charmed, accepting compliments with that practiced tilt of her chin. Social media was her theater. I began an online audit, interviews she'd given, credits on other projects, screenshots of campaigns credited to her. Where things were fuzzy, I dug deeper. Where there were gaps, I kept a mental note. It happened faster than I'd expected. An old client of Vanessa's, someone from her earlier boutique PR days, reached out anonymously after seeing a post of hers and wondering why they hadn't been credited for work he recognized. He'd assumed she'd paid the credit forward, the way PR folks sometimes did, credit swaps and favors. But when he saw alignment between her new ideas and work he'd once done for another brand, curiosity turned to concern. A second voice had begun to speak in the corner of the room, a quiet chorus that questioned the story she was telling. At a panel 2 weeks later, an executive from a firm Vanessa used to consult for asked an offhand question. Vanessa, your recent portfolio seems strikingly similar to a product launch we partnered on 3 years ago. Are these new iterations or reworkings? Vanessa laughed it off, her hand flying to her chest, offended performance on cue. She said, I always bring a fresh perspective, but the seed of doubt was planted, and not even her polished smile could uproot it. I didn't stop at professional exposure. If I wanted a lesson with teeth, it had to bite in places she cared about. Friends, social standing, even the small comfort she'd built for herself. That meant taking my time on the one thing Vanessa prized most, her reputation for being the reliable, stylish connector. If people began to whisper that her connections were shallow, her social currency would deflate. So I planned something that looked like an accident. I worked with a contact at a boutique creative agency, someone who owed me a favor, to quietly request a reprint of a limited-run portfolio Vanessa had shown at a recent event. The agency obliged, sending a beautifully bound copy to a colleague address. I timed it for a Saturday, the day of Vanessa's monthly brunch at that skylit rooftop everyone loved. She would be distracted, relaxed, unguarded. The band of ladies in their oversized sunglasses would be gossip-hungry and ready. The morning of the brunch, I watched the little performance unfold from a distance. Vanessa floated through the crowd, kissing cheeks, recounting stories of her overnight success. When the courier arrived, professionally attired, polite, the hostess accepted the package on Vanessa's behalf, assuming it was another congratulatory gift. The binding was exquisite. The paper smelled of money. The portfolio was the kind of thing that, in the wrong hands, could make or break a reputation. I'd instructed the agency contact to include a small, subtle detail that would make the portfolio look like authentic work, but with a twist. A watermark in the corner with the name of a small boutique firm that had previously done the original concept. It was plausible, an oversight that could happen in printing. When Vanessa opened the portfolio and began to thumb through, one of the brunch companions, a junior creative who had been on the original project, did a double take. "Wait," she said, a laugh catching. "This looks exactly like the package we did for Aria & Co. What's their name doing here?" There was a palpable pause, like the intake before a storm. Vanessa's smile, for the first time in months, faltered. She closed the portfolio quickly and laughed too loudly, forcing the moment away. But the rumor had slipped loose. That evening, men and women in the industry started sending curious DMs. "Did you see the Aria watermark? Isn't that the work from 2019? Weird." The whispers multiplied. Gossip is an animal that devours attention. Every whisper was fuel for the next desecration of her persona. But I didn't gloat. I kept my head down because the real damage needed to be structural. Public skepticism was good. Legal trouble would be better. So I compiled a dossier. Emails with timestamps showing the evolution of the concept. The mock-up saved under my account long before Vanessa ever mentioned the startup. Slack logs where I'd pitch the taglines in internal channels. I printed everything. I organized it. I filed it. Precision was my ally. The opening night for the startup campaign, an invitation-only showcase with influencers and venture partners, scheduled in a month, loomed as the final stage. That night would be Vanessa's coronation, or her correction. I had to be surgical. One wrong move and she'd pin blame on someone else. In private, I also stitched a safety net. Vanessa had a hunger that sometimes overcame her caution. She loved to be the center of a narrative, and if the narrative could be fun and viral, all the better. I found a few journalists who liked to pick at glossy facades, not vultures, investigative people who loved an ethical puzzle. I fed them lines. There's interesting metadata in the campaign files. A few names seem to be missing from credits. They asked for documentation. I provided what I had. Carefully curated, impeccably sourced. 2 weeks before the event, the tone of Vanessa's messages shifted. Where she once texted me pictures of celebratory cocktails and "we did it" heart emojis, she now sent curt replies and vague excuses. Her posture in the office changed. She was more guarded, haunted by the knowledge that rumors once airborne can't be easily recalled. People who had once sought her invitation began to ask for verification. Her calendar invitations dwindled. Then a new, humiliating strand emerged. A vendor she had relied upon for PR materials leaked a contract showing she'd been billing the same content as original to multiple clients. When the Startups Council called, questions were asked. We need to be sure our creative assets are legally unencumbered. It's amazing how quickly legal caution chills the heat of celebration. The party she'd planned began to feel like a trial at the edge of town. My role in all of this remained invisible. I crafted every narrative off stage, handed evidence to people who would speak about it without naming me, nudged investigative curiosity without attaching my voice to it. Revenge, as I had learned, is best served anonymously at first. Let the person drown in the public fallout while you keep your hands clean. But of course, Vanessa wasn't without claws. The night before the showcase, she called, voice low and brittle. "Kat, I know things are weird. She began. "Is that because people are asking for receipts now?" I asked, letting the accusation sit. She swallowed. "This could ruin everything. For you, too," she said, with a twist of manipulation that was meant to guilt me into silence. "For me?" I repeated. "You stole my presentation, Vanessa. You stole months of work. If this ruins you, it's because you built a house of cards." I'm not the one who will be ruined. My voice was steady, colder than she had ever heard it. Silence followed. When she spoke again, it was almost a whisper. You don't have to do this. We were friends. I agreed. Friends don't take livelihoods. I hung up. The following evening arrived like the hush before a verdict. Industry glitter converged on the gallery venue. Tech founders, VCs, influential lifestyle editors. Vanessa swept in wearing a silk dress and a necklace that glittered like someone else's promises. She gave a crisp, practiced talk and then unveiled the campaign with dramatic flourish. Voices in the crowd murmured. Someone discreetly tiled a slide from an older campaign, my older campaign, and when the slide landed on the screen, a ripple of recognition went through the audience. Smartphones were raised. DMs were sent. Comments began to appear under posts. Why does that look so familiar? Isn't that from Arya? A journalist, whom I had quietly alerted, stood up and asked to see the original file.
Vanessa's hands trembled for the first time in months. She smiled, but it was too late. The architecture of her story had a crumbling foundation. Backstage, her PR handler whispered frantic instructions. Spin, deflect, pivot. There is always a handler in chaos, willing to shove people back into the narrative that benefits the client. Vanessa tried to pivot to inspiration and collaboration. The words hung like wet laundry, saturated and heavy. When the room emptied that night and the 300 guests had dispersed into the cold night, Vanessa walked out alone, unmoored. I watched her across the street from my car, a single silhouette under the sodium streetlight, and for the first time I felt something like sorrow. Not sympathy, definitely not sympathy, but a tiny ache for the person she could have been. The city hummed around us, indifferent. There were still steps to take. Public humiliation and industry skepticism were rituals, but I needed permanence. I needed a formal record, a legal knot that would hold as everything else frayed. So I finalized the dossier, put it in a folder, and scheduled a meeting for Monday morning with a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and business theft. I slept the sleep of someone who has labored. And when I woke, I had a plan for the final move. Vanessa's undoing would not be a single dramatic headline. There would be a series of consequences, legal and reputational, designed to close the door on the kind of theft she'd attempted. It would be satisfying. It would also be just, but the city never wastes time, and revenge, as I had learned, invites its own complications. There were people who still loved Vanessa, people who believed in her unconditionally, and they would fight back. I steeled myself for those counterpunches. In the quiet that followed, I ran my fingers across the dossier and whispered, very quietly, "You had your chance." Monday morning came like a verdict. I'd slept badly, running the final scene in my head. The documents, the lawyer's calm voice, the courthouse lights. The dossier was thick. Every file, every timestamp, every witness statement. I dressed in my court outfit, a navy sheath dress that made me feel taller, a simple pendant that had belonged to my grandmother. It's funny how ritual helps when you're stepping into battle. At the law office, Mr. Alvarez, an impeccably organized IP litigator with a jaw that didn't smile often, walked me through the plan again. We'll file for immediate injunctive relief and a temporary restraining order to freeze any accounts tied to the campaign, he said. We'll ask the court to order a forensic audit of the creative assets. Most important, we need to establish prima facie evidence that these assets originated with you. He slid my printed timeline across the polished table. It was clinical and precise, and I felt steady as a metronome. We filed the motion by lunch. The judge, a woman who wore her experience like armor, granted an emergency hearing within 72 hours. Fast, like the legal system sometimes can be when money and reputations are on the line. Vanessa's lawyer called immediately, venom barely under the voice. If you proceed, he warned, be prepared for countersuits. We will allege defamation. Then bring it, Mr. Alvarez said quietly. We'll show them the evidence. I almost laughed. The courtroom can be a theater of threats. The real work is in documents and timestamps. The hearing was 2 days later, in a small sunlit courtroom where everyone seemed to speak in measured tones. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back, less glamorous than at the launch, more like someone preparing for interrogation. She gave me a look that tried to combine apology and accusation. I did not meet it. I sat with Mr. Alvarez and our exhibits.
a neat stack like bricks. When the judge called the case, the gallery was full of people who knew of the story. Journalists, a few industry folks, the startup council. Vanessa's lawyer tried the obvious tactic, attack credibility. He leaned forward and said, "Your Honor, my client is an entrepreneur who executed brilliantly. These are sour grapes from someone who couldn't handle the spotlight." Mr. Alvarez stood. He was quiet but authoritative. He presented the timeline, the Slack messages, the drafts saved under my account with earlier timestamps, the original concept emails I'd sent to 3 separate colleagues months before the pitch. He showed the metadata on the digital files, dates, times, device IDs. The court tech displayed the screen at the judge's nod. It was technical, boring, and damning. Vanessa's lawyer sputtered. He had none of that. He had charm, theatrical objections, and a PR strategy. He countered with plausible deniability. Ideas evolve. Collaboration happens. There is no theft. The judge, methodical and not easily impressed, asked a simple question. Can you demonstrate ownership? Vanessa's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Then Mr. Alvarez handed the judge a printed email chain where Vanessa herself had forwarded my original deck to a mutual investor 2 months before the meeting, adding in her own words, "We should present this as a refined concept with some polish." The email included my header, my logo, and my rough mock-ups. It was a smoking gun. Vanessa's throat worked. Her defense dissolved into a series of qualified statements that sounded eerily like the earlier casual explanation she had given me over coffee. The judge granted the temporary restraining order. Vanessa was ordered to cease presenting the campaign as hers. The startup was to freeze any payments pending audit, and both parties were to produce full creative records for independent forensic review. It was not the final legal victory, but it was the hammer that closed a door. What followed was a slow-motion unspooling. Investigators pulled file servers, forensic analysts traced the draft history. The startup's counsel issued a terse statement that the funds would be held in escrow pending the audit. Social channels that had applauded Vanessa's supposed brilliance now carried murmurings of concern. Has anyone vetted this campaign? Interesting metadata discrepancy. People love schadenfreude, especially when it comes with receipts.
Vanessa panicked. She sent me messages pleading for mercy, for a chance to fix what she called a misunderstanding. "I never meant for this to go this far," she wrote, fingers betraying the casual cruelty in the past. "I was scared you wouldn't get the job, and I took a risk. Can't we talk?" I read them all, then deleted them. I wasn't cruel. I was exact. The difference matters. There is a point where accountability must be exact, measured, and public. She'd had the chance to fix this privately. She chose otherwise. There were smaller, delicious consequences, too. The brunch hostess who had once fetishized Vanessa's curated life now called to say, "We can't host her events anymore." An agency that had quietly subcontracted work to Vanessa decided to rescind her credit. Even the boutique printing house where her fake portfolio had been printed received a flood of calls asking about their vetting process. Reputation is an ecosystem. Once the water becomes toxic, the plants wither. But the court's ruling had the final legal sting. 3 months later, the forensic audit concluded that the campaign's development history pointed to my accounts and devices for original artwork and taglines. Vanessa's role, the report said, was editorial polish. Under cross-examination, she tried to claim creative ownership, laughably unconvincing in the face of time-stamped drafts. The judge issued a permanent injunction. The campaign materials were to be credited to me, damages were assessed, and Vanessa was ordered to pay a portion of the legal fees. The startup issued a formal apology and agreed to move forward with me as their lead strategist. That last part, me standing in a conference room weeks later with the startup's founders, rolling up my sleeves and directing creatives, felt almost surreal. It was vindication, certainly. It was also a test of whether I'd be the same person who'd pitched months ago, terrified and hungry. I wasn't. I was steadier. I'd learned patience. I'd learned how to measure consequences. What about Vanessa? She left town to take a break, according to a terse social post that read like a press release for shame. A few industry whispers said her freelancing gigs dried up. Another said one of her major clients had blacklisted her. I heard later that she'd moved to a small coastal town, taking work where reputation mattered less. There was no gloating in me.
Her dismantled world was a cautionary tale, not joy. Just a clean justice. Friends who had been hesitant at first, people who loved Vanessa for the party she threw or the spare room at brunch, began to apologize quietly. "We didn't see it," they'd say. Face shamefaced. I accepted some apologies and gently refused others. There's a difference between someone who was misled and someone who chose to dance on your grave. I'd learned to spot both. There were personal costs. The months of litigation had drained my savings, demanded time away from work, and frayed nerves. Mr. Alvarez negotiated a settlement that covered legal fees and provided a compensation stipend. Not everything, but enough to clear the worst of the debt. The startup offered a modest bonus for the disruption. More importantly, I had my credibility back, and in our industry, that is currency. On the morning the campaign launched under my name, the office was calmer than I expected. I stood at the front of the room, watching the creative team test the final edits, the photography, the tagline animations. There was no dramatic trumpet, no swelling score, just the hum of people doing the work. I felt a quiet pride that wasn't about revenge, but about survival. I had turned a theft into a career. That evening, I walked the city streets alone, letting the lights wash over me. I thought of Vanessa, not to relish her fall, but to acknowledge the terrible freedom of consequence. We are all the sum of our choices, I reminded myself, and some choices damage others in ways that can't be undone. In the month that followed, my life settled into a different rhythm. I traveled for the startup's product shoots, taught a master class at a local university, and mentored junior strategists who reminded me of the hungry woman I used to be. I kept close a few old friends, people who had stood by me without the need for spectacle. The world continued, as it always does, indifferent and busy. One afternoon, about a year after the whole mess began, I saw Vanessa at a transit stop. She'd aged a little, hair shorter, face freckled by a seaside wind, perhaps. She didn't look like an interview headline. She looked like a person who had gone through something and returned with fewer theatrical flourishes. We made eye contact. She gave a small, almost embarrassed nod. I nodded back. I didn't walk over. What would I say? Forgive me? Tell me you're sorry? There's a point where words are insufficient, where the ledger has been settled and the balance is paid. I went home and made dinner. I hung a new print in my living room, a simple line from my grandmother's letters: measure twice, cut once. It's not just advice for carpentry, it's guidance for life. I'd measured, I'd acted, and I'd rebuilt. If you ask me whether I felt triumphant, I'd say no. I felt factual. I'd reclaimed what was mine. In a world where charm often masks greed, I'd learned to let evidence do the talking. Vanessa's lesson was that theft has consequences. Mine was that justice, patient, legal, and methodical, can be more beautiful than revenge. I still keep the navy dress for court days, but mostly I keep the quiet knowledge that when someone tries to steal your life's work, there is a road forward. Collect the proof, call the lawyers, and let the system you once admired do its job. Walk through with integrity, and you will find your way back.